Opening. Cut off behind the lines. How did one man survive 3 days behind enemy lines, completely cut off, surrounded by German troops, with no chance of rescue in sight? And how did this brief window of terror end up changing everything for his unit? On the frozen morning of 14th February 1945, near the village of Schleiden in the Hurtgen Forest, a young American infantryman from the 2nd Infantry Division found himself alone in one of the most lethal stretches of woodland on the Western Front. By that stage of the war, the Battle of the Bulge had officially ended, but scattered German units still held pockets of forest and ridgeline positions in the Eifel region, turning every patrol into a deadly gamble. The soldier at the center of this story belonged to an infantry company tasked with probing forward, locating enemy strongpoints, and keeping pressure on withdrawing German forces as the Allies pushed toward the Rhine. Background: the man and the mission. To understand how 3 days behind enemy lines could alter the fate of an entire battalion, the larger context of early 1945 on the Western Front is essential. In December 1944, Adolf Hitler had launched his final great offensive in the West, driving more than 200,000 troops, supported by panzer divisions, into the Ardennes and punching a massive bulge into the Allied lines. Though the offensive failed, the fighting left a chaotic front line by February, with shattered divisions, isolated strongpoints, and dangerous gaps on both sides. The U.S. 2nd Infantry Division, hardened by earlier campaigns in Normandy and Brittany, had been shifted into this sector to help straighten the line and grind down remaining German resistance in the Hurtgen and Eifel forests. Its rifle companies were built around small squads of 9 to 12 men, armed with M1 Garand rifles, Browning automatic rifles, and supported by .30 caliber machine guns and 60mm mortars at the platoon level. These units were expected to patrol aggressively, identify enemy machine gun nests and artillery observation posts, and call back vital information. The soldier in this story was a junior enlisted rifleman, the kind of man whose name often disappears into casualty lists and after-action reports. He had already survived the bitter winter battles of December and January, where temperatures regularly dropped below freezing and frostbite could incapacitate as surely as shrapnel. By mid-February, he and his comrades were exhausted but experienced, moving through woods where every snapped twig could signal a patrol, and every clearing might be pre-sighted by German machine guns and mortars. On 14th February, his company was ordered to send out a reinforced patrol toward a series of low hills overlooking a road network the Germans still used to shift troops and supplies. The objective was simple on paper: determine whether German forces still occupied the high ground, mark enemy firing positions, and report back before nightfall. Patrols like this rarely made headlines, yet they formed the backbone of frontline intelligence. Little did anyone know that this particular mission would be remembered for one man's 3-day struggle to stay alive and keep moving. Building tension into the forest. The patrol stepped off shortly after 0900 hours, moving in staggered formation along a faint trail through the tall conifers of the Hurtgen forest. Snow clung to the branches, muting sound, and visibility was limited to perhaps 50 to 80 yards in most directions. The men advanced cautiously, weapons at the ready, scanning for telltale signs of German presence: disturbed snow, cut branches, or the dark mouth of a foxhole. By 10:30 hours, they had covered nearly 800 yards from their own lines, nearing a shallow draw where a small stream cut through the forest floor. The patrol leader, a seasoned sergeant, signaled a brief halt to check their position against a folded map and confirm the route toward the ridge beyond. At that moment, two things happened almost simultaneously. A distant German mortar battery began adjusting fire onto a nearby American unit, and a German listening post, concealed just 200 to 300 yards ahead, detected the patrol's movement. The first shots came without warning. A German MG-42, emplaced on the far slope of the draw, opened up with its trademark high rate of fire, sending bursts of 7.92mm rounds ripping through the trees and churning up the snow. The patrol dove for cover, returning fire with Garens and BARs, but the enemy gun was well concealed and supported by at least one rifle squad on either flank. Within seconds, the quiet forest erupted into a chaotic storm of muzzle flashes, splintered bark, and shouted commands. By 1100 hours, the situation had deteriorated. German mortars began to bracket the draw, each round exploding with a deafening crack, showering the men with splinters of wood and steel. The patrol leader realized they had stumbled into a prepared defensive position, anchoring the German line in this sector. He ordered a fighting withdrawal back toward friendly lines, using short rushes from tree to tree, while a portion of the patrol laid down covering fire. In the confusion, amid smoke, exploding shells, and the disorienting echo of gunfire, one man became separated from the rest. As the main body pulled back downhill, our soldier, pinned behind a fallen log, misread the direction of the retreat. Believing his comrades had shifted left, he crawled and then sprinted in that direction, only to find himself moving deeper into the German defensive zone. Within minutes, a curtain of mortar and small arms fire cut off his route of return. The forest that had felt like a shield just hours before now became a maze of deadly blind corners. 10 o'clock to 15 o'clock. Building tension, alone behind enemy lines. By 1200 hours, the fighting around the draw had died down as the German defenders consolidated their positions, and the remnants of the patrol reached their own lines with incomplete reports and several missing men. Among those unaccounted for was the rifleman who had drifted to the left and now lay motionless behind a clump of trees, listening as enemy voices shouted in German only a short distance away. The realization settled on him slowly. He was alone, behind enemy lines, and the front had effectively closed in behind him. He checked his gear. His M1 Garand still had a full clip loaded, with additional ammunition in his cartridge belt. He carried 2 fragmentation grenades, a canteen half filled with icy water, and a basic first aid pouch. His rations were limited to what he had taken for the day's patrol, hardly enough for 3 days, but at that moment, survival for the next 3 hours felt like a more urgent objective. The air was bitterly cold, and as the afternoon wore on, the snow under his elbows melted slightly, then refroze, drawing heat from his body. By 1400 hours, he began to move again, inches at a time, crawling uphill to gain a better view of his surroundings. Through the trees, he caught glimpses of German positions, a camouflaged machine gun nest covering a shallow ravine, a pair of soldiers tending to ammunition boxes, and, further back, the faint outline of a dug-in mortar pit. Unintentionally, his desperate retreat had placed him in a vantage point from which he could observe a key section of the German line that his unit's officers had only guessed at. Little did he know that every small detail he absorbed in the next 3 days would later shape his battalion's next attack. As daylight faded toward 1700 hours, he worked his way into a shallow depression partially shielded by fallen branches. From here, he could see a narrow forest road, just 250 to 300 yards away, where German supply sleds and small vehicles occasionally passed, moving ammunition and rations to forward positions. The temptation to fire was strong. A single burst into a passing wagon would no doubt cause panic, but he understood the math. One man firing behind enemy lines would attract swift and overwhelming retaliation. The mission, unplanned as it was, had shifted from combat to survival and observation. By 1900 hours, full darkness covered the forest. The cold deepened, and with it came a new set of threats: hypothermia, disorientation, and the constant risk of wandering straight into an enemy camp. He decided to remain in place for the night, huddling beneath his field jacket and using branches to insulate himself from the snow. He rationed his water to a few careful sips and forced himself to stay awake in short intervals, wary of the danger of slipping into deep sleep in sub-freezing temperatures. The crisis: 3 days of survival. The first full day behind enemy lines began at around 0600 hours on the 15th of February, when the distant rumble of artillery fire woke him from a light, restless doze. The front was still active. Somewhere behind him, American guns were exchanging fire with German batteries, and the thunder rolled across the treetops like an approaching storm. For a moment, the young infantryman felt completely cut off from both sides, too far to reach his own lines, yet dangerously close to the enemy whose positions surrounded him. By 0800 hours, German activity around his position increased. He watched as small squads moved forward, likely rotating positions or conducting local patrols to check for American infiltration. Twice, groups of 3 or 4 soldiers passed within 50 to 70 yards of his hiding place, their boots crunching on the snow, their breath visible in the cold air. Each time he lay completely still, controlling his breathing, gripping his rifle but resisting the urge to move. One careless shift, one snapped twig, could bring a hail of fire crashing down on him. At midday, hunger began to gnaw at him. His meager rations were running low, forcing a grim calculation. Eat everything now and face hunger later, or stretch each bite over an uncertain number of days. He chose the latter, breaking apart what remained into small pieces and spacing them across the day. Thirst was another challenge. Melting snow in his mouth offered limited relief, but also cooled his body further, so he alternated between small sips of water and small amounts of snow, constantly balancing his need for hydration against the risk of accelerated heat loss. By 1400 hours, around the same time he had gotten lost the previous day, the psychological weight of isolation pressed heavily on him. Thoughts of his company, of whether anyone realized he was missing, mixed with more practical concerns about ammunition and the possibility of capture. He knew from grim stories and briefings that being taken prisoner behind the line could mean harsh treatment, forced marches, and uncertain survival. The forest, with all its dangers, still felt like a better option than surrender. Late that afternoon, a sudden movement near the road caught his eye. A small German liaison group, perhaps 5 or 6 men, paused near a bend in the track to study a map and confer. From their gestures and the way they pointed toward the ridgeline, the soldier could infer something critical. The Germans were adjusting their defenses, shifting at least one machine gun position to cover a suspected avenue of American advance. He memorized the location. A distinctive split tree, a shallow berm of earth, and a line of sandbags partially concealed under snow. That night, 15 to 16 February, would be the hardest. Temperatures fell again, and a light wind began to move through the treetops, making the forest creak and moan. At some point, after 2200 hours, distant flares momentarily lit up the sky to his rear, as either side probed or fired harassing rounds. For a few seconds at a time, the snow around him glowed pale, then plunged back into darkness. Sleep came in short, exhausted bursts, each one haunted by the fear of waking to find German soldiers standing over him. By dawn on the 16th of February, he had been behind enemy lines for roughly 36 hours. His fingers were stiff from the cold despite gloves, and his legs ached from hours of crouching and lying in awkward positions. Still, he forced himself to move again, inching to a new vantage point a little higher on the slope, to avoid leaving a clear pattern in the snow that might be noticed. This movement, slow and deliberate, occupied much of the morning. Around 1100 hours on the second full day, he spotted something that shifted the balance from mere survival to active contribution. A new German mortar pit, perhaps 80 to 100 yards beyond the original one he had seen, was being prepared, with men carrying tubes, base plates, and ammunition crates into position. From their orientation, he could tell these mortars were meant to fire not sideways down the line, but toward the American-held slopes he had left 2 days earlier. The enemy was reinforcing, preparing for either a spoiling attack or stiffening their defense against an expected push. As the day wore on, the lack of food began to sap his strength, and his thoughts turned to the risk of making a break for it. If he moved at night, he might slip through the gaps between German positions, using the terrain and his knowledge from 2 days of observation to skirt strong points. but a wrong turn could put him directly in the line of fire of a machine gun or mortar he had not yet seen. The stakes could not have been higher. Stay and risk starvation or discovery, move and risk immediate death. By nightfall on the 16th of February, his second night behind enemy lines, he made his decision. He would move, but not yet. One more day of watching might give him enough information to both find a safer route back and provide his unit with details that could save many lives. It was an extraordinary choice for a single enlisted man to make alone in the dark, but it reflected the discipline and training instilled in frontline infantry. Information, as much as firepower, could turn battles. Turning point, from survivor to scout. The third day, 17th February, began with a fragile sense of purpose. Exhausted and hungry, the soldier nonetheless approached the hours ahead with a new mindset. He was no longer simply hiding, he was gathering intelligence. Every German movement, every shouted order, every vehicle that passed along the forest road became a piece of a larger puzzle. By 0900 hours, he had identified at least 2 distinct machine gun nests, 1 primary mortar position, and a secondary emplacement, a probable company command post dug into a small knoll near the road, and the approximate location of a communications line. He counted the number of men rotating through certain trenches, noting that some positions seemed under strength, possibly as a result of earlier fighting. He watched as a runner dashed from one dugout to another, tracing in his mind the network of paths that connected the defensive line. At around 1100 hours, a brief firefight broke out several hundred yards away, as an American probing attack tested the German front. From his vantage point, he could see muzzle flashes and the arcs of tracer rounds, and, more importantly, he could observe how the Germans responded, which positions opened fire, which remained silent, and where reserve elements moved in. This living map of enemy reactions was something no aerial photograph could fully capture. By early afternoon, he knew it was time. Ammunition and strength were finite. The more he delayed, the greater the risk of capture or collapse. He oriented himself using the position of the sun and the knowledge that his own lines lay generally to the west and slightly south. At 1700 hours, as shadows lengthened among the trees, he began his withdrawal. Every movement was deliberate. He advanced in short bursts of 10 to 15 yards, then froze, listening for any sign that he had been detected. Twice, German voices sounded uncomfortably close, and once he dropped flat as a pair of soldiers passed less than 40 yards above him, their boots sliding slightly on the icy ground. His heart hammered, but his training held. Steady breathing, quiet movements, no sudden shifts. As the forest grew darker, the distant shape of the ridgeline he sought came into view, silhouetted faintly against the sky. Around 1900 hours, after nearly 2 hours of crawling, crouching, and sprinting between cover, he heard a new sound, the distinct crack of American small arms fire coming from ahead and to the left. It was both a promise and a warning. He was nearing his own lines, but this was still a contested zone, and any moving shape could be assumed to be the enemy. At approximately 2000 hours, he reached the edge of a shallow ravine he recognized from the patrol's outbound route 3 days earlier. Risking exposure, he moved up onto a small rise and called out, using a prearranged password and challenge. For a tense few seconds, there was no response. Then, from the darkness ahead, came the correct countersign, followed by the cautious silhouettes of 2 American riflemen emerging from behind a log. He had made it. Dragged into a nearby foxhole and then escorted back to the company command post, the soldier's ordeal was finally over. But the story was not. Over the next several hours, he would recount, in painstaking detail, everything he had seen. Officers bent over maps and aerial photos as he pointed out mortar pits, machine gun nests, and command dugouts, turning his 3 days of terror into a tactical blueprint. What happened next would become legendary within his unit. Resolution and legacy, how it changed everything. In the early hours of the 18th of February 1945, using the information he had brought back, the battalion staff adjusted their planned attack on the German line. Artillery concentrations were shifted to target the mortar positions and command post he had located. Infantry companies were redirected to avoid the strongest machine gun sectors and instead exploit weaker flanks he had identified on the third day. Shortly after dawn, American artillery opened up, pounding the precise coordinates he had described. Forward observers confirmed that at least one German mortar pit and several dugouts were destroyed in the initial barrage. When the infantry advanced, they encountered fierce resistance, but not the devastating crossfire that might have awaited them had those positions remained untouched. Casualties were still painful, as they always were in the Hurtgen, but significantly lower than officers had feared. The line bent and then broke, forcing the German defenders to pull back toward the interior of the Reich. Within the battalion, word spread quickly. The success of the morning's operation owed much to the terrifying 3-day ordeal of a single rifleman who had refused to panic behind enemy lines. His report had turned random survival into decisive intelligence. At the company level, his comrades saw him not only as the man who had somehow lived through 72 hours alone, but as the reason many of them were still